Good morning, I'm Nina and I'm presenting my bachelor thesis today, titled Conceptually Organizing Typologies of Human-Nature Relationships. I was supervised by Professor Renata Pardini as part of the Conservation Science Research Group at the University of São Paulo in Brazil. To introduce our work, I will present the concept of human-nature relationships, the structure of a typology, and the goals of this review. In the context of the current global socio-environmental crisis, human-nature relationships have been emerging as a concept of increasing relevance in conservation science. In general, human-nature relationships can be defined as a set of beliefs that a person or a collective of people hold about their relationship to the modern human world. Broadly speaking, this concept can be studied from two main perspectives. An individual perspective, which looks at how cognitive, psychological, and emotional processes shape a person's beliefs about human-nature relationships, and a social perspective, which analyzes how human-nature relationships are culturally constructed and therefore may vary among different societies, time periods, etc. Understanding different conceptions of human-nature relationships has been shown to be important for modeling socio-ecological systems, for conserving both biological and cultural diversity, which are closely associated to one another, and for communicating views of different stakeholders in conflict mediation. Human-nature relationships may also be a key driver for change, both at an individual level as precursors to pro-environmental behavior, and at a social level as a pivotal leverage point for socio-environmental transformation. Given the importance and challenges of studying human-nature relationships, a tool that has been increasingly used by researchers in this field are typologies. Typologies organize the complexity of a multidimensional phenomenon by synthesizing it into a set of types. What a typology does is to take a complex issue and decompose it into its fundamental dimensions, or the unidimensional aspects that make it up. From there, we may build a set of types that describe the variation within a phenomenon by observing patterns in how these dimensions are combined. To give a simple example, Aristotle's four elements are a typology of matter. He took a complex topic, the composition of matter, and decomposed it into two dimensions, moisture, which can be dry or wet, and temperature, which can be hot or cold. From the combination of these dimensions, he got four types of matter. Dry and hot matter is fire, dry and cold matter is air, and so on. This capacity of typologies to organize complexity and describe patterns of emergence makes them particularly well suited to represent social realities, including human-nature relationships. Considering all of this, our goal with this work was to conceptually organize the main typologies of human-nature relationships proposed in conservation science and to compare them as to their context of development, that is, when and where they were first proposed, their construction method, including if it was deductive or inductive, qualitative or quantitative, and anchored or not in a specific social environmental context, and finally and most importantly, which dimensions of human-nature relationships were considered and which types of human-nature relationship were described. About the methods used in this work. We started by selecting human-nature relationship typologies within the scope of conservation science based on Flint's 2013 review. Snowballing from her work and previously known literature provided us with a few more additions, totalizing 9 typologies considered for our study, which are listed here. We searched for the original article proposing each typology and gathered data from Scopus regarding its development, as well as classified their construction method. Finally, we looked at whether the dimensions considered for each typology were systematically made explicit or not. In almost half of the typologies, they were only partially explicit or not mentioned at all, and in these cases, we extracted the dimensions ourselves based on the description of types. Then we codified both the dimensions and types, and every code that appeared more than once was included in a final systematization. I will now present you our results and briefly discuss them. The 9 typologies we consider range from the late 70s all the way to very recent years. Out of the 9, 4 have generated a continuous body of applications after being published, while 6 have not been used again after being proposed. There are only 2 typologies from the Global South here in blue, while all others are either from the US in red or Europe in orange, including all that continue to be used after publication. Typologies from the United States are also by far the most cited, here in shades of blue, and 2 out of the 3 less cited ones include non-Western contexts, the Arctic and Cape Horn in Chile. In short, there is a strong Western bias in human-nature relationship typologies. US and European typologies are not only being more produced, but also more reproduced once they are published in the form of continuous application and more listened to, as they are far more cited than their non-Western counterparts. This is a serious issue since, as we established, human-nature relationships are culturally dependent. When analyzing construction methods, we found that the anchoring of typologies in specific socio-environmental contexts fell along a spectrum, ranging from typologies based on a completely generic idea of nature to those which were completely anchored in a particular context, with a few variations in the middle. The type of construction and of data collected were also associated with the degree of anchoring. The generic typologies were also the deductive ones, either completely theoretical or which based dimensions and types on literature and only use data for testing them. The two generic ones that use contextualized examples were the ones with mixed methods, basing dimensions on theory and types on data collection. Both these groups used quantitative data. On the other hand, typologies which were primarily based on a specific context were also inductive in their construction, basing dimensions and types on data collection and using qualitative data for that. It is important to notice that the completely anchored typologies are two out of the three which work with a less Western context, and are also the only to emphasize indigenous views. The associations we found suggest that inductive and qualitative approaches may be more well suited to let these context-dependent views emerge from the data, instead of imposing the general Western concept of nature as standard, as it happens with more deductive and quantitative approaches. At last, I'm going to talk about the dimensions and types of human-nature relationships that we found across typologies and systematized. We organized all dimensions which appeared in at least two typologies into four big domains of human-nature relationships, with 2 dimensions each. The first domain is conceptions about nature. It includes the dimension of positionality, which comprises how nature is positioned in relation to humans, that is, if humans are part of nature or not, and if nature is inferior, superior, or equal to humans. And it also encompasses what nature is understood to be, including if it has agency or not, and all forms of knowledge about it. The second domain is interactions with nature, which looks at what are the goals of these interactions and if they are oriented towards humans or nature, and what kinds of interactions actually take place between natural and human agents. The third domain is the domain of ethics, which holds the questions of whether and why is nature valued, and what are the rights and responsibilities of both humans and nature in relation to one another. And finally, the fourth domain is relationality, which covers the affective bonds between humans and nature, be they emotional, spiritual, or caring, and also the dimension of identity, that is, identitary bonds with land, family, culture, and personal history that are embedded in nature. This last domain, and particularly the dimension of identity, are the least frequent across different typologies. To organize our summary of types of human nature relationships, we spread them across 2 axes based on the most frequent dimensions, which were more comparable. So here, the horizontal axis represents the affective bond between humans and nature, from negative to positive, and on the vertical axis we have the degree of responsibility that humans hold for nature, from inexistent to high. First, we have the domination type, which is characterized by perceiving nature as a threat to society and civilization that needs to be conquered or exterminated so that humans can reach progress. This is the type at the root of Western modernity, of colonialism, and traditional Western science. Then we have the use type, which isn't negative towards nature as much as neutral. Nature is a source of resources to be used and explored as it suits the needs of humans, with no rights or importance of its own. It is the type behind the ecosystem services metaphor and greenwashed capitalism. The domination and use types share many similarities and are often presented together as a single type. We then have the apathy type, which represents maximum disconnection from nature. It is marked by disinterest and indifference towards nature, which is not perceived to be relevant or even present in daily life at all. This is the predominant type in most large urban centers today. The intellectual type is characterized by a rational interest in nature as an object to be studied, while the aesthetic type sees nature as a source of beauty or aesthetic experiences in general. Both are very abstract and distant ways of relating to nature. The stewardship type is mainly defined by a sense of guardianship towards nature, which is seen as a vulnerable separate entity which holds some intrinsic rights and needs human protection to survive. This protection comes in the form of isolating nature from all human interference. This type is very pervasive in Western culture, coming from biblical views of nature as God's gift and finding a modern revival in traditional conservation science. The care type, on the other hand, also holds humans responsible for taking care of nature, but is the first of all that I mentioned to not view nature as a separate entity. Instead, nature and humans are part of the same whole and need to work together in order to thrive. This type may be found among some more hands-on versions of conservation, as well as many traditional communities that live from the land or the water. The type of the most positive affective bond is the affective participation type, which is marked by a very deep sense of belonging to nature, often with spiritual connotations. This view is common among New Age Western movements and the like. Finally, we also found two non-Western types in the typologies, which I'm not going to place on the axis because they operate in radically distinct ways in relation to the 8 Western types. In the devotion type, nature is sacred and superior to humans, composed or inhabited by divine beings that humans need to please. This type may be found in some South Asian cultures, for example, as we can see with Indian sacred groves. And lastly, the active reciprocity type is characteristic of Amerindian cultures. In this type, human and more than human elements are all part of the same not natural but social whole, and all interactions must be based on diplomatic horizontal exchanges between beings. In both of these types, what we would call nature is an entity with agency, which is a very deep difference from Western ontologies. These two types were not very widespread in the typologies, in contrast to the 3 most cited ones, which are also the most common in Western cultures: use, stewardship, and domination. Again, this shows how biased human-nature relationship typologies are towards views from the US and Europe at the expense of non-Western perspectives. So, to conclude, I would like to reinforce how crucial it is to go beyond this Western bias, and a possible way of doing that is through more inductive and qualitative approaches, as well as anchoring works in specific socio-environmental contexts. Finally, it seems more and more important to pay attention to relational aspects of the human-nature connection, and there is much to expand on that. If we want to understand how people relate to nature beyond the Western culture that has brought us to the current socio-environmental crisis, we need to change the way we conceive of nature itself, not as an object of protection or use, but as an entity with whom we weave relationships. I would like to thank Professor Renata, my research group and my families for their support, and the ATBC team for the opportunity to present this talk today. Thank you very much.